The Peterson family's world shattered on a humid July afternoon in 1996 when their 8-year-old daughter Lily vanished from their front yard in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. What began as a typical summer day in the middle-class neighborhood of Westfield, children playing hopscotch on the sidewalk, neighbors watering their lawns against the relentless desert heat, the ice cream truck's familiar melody echoing through the tree-lined streets, became every parent's worst nightmare. One moment Lily was there, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she chased fireflies in the fading daylight, her laughter mixing with the sound of sprinklers and distant television programs drifting through open windows. And the next moment, she was gone, without a trace. The afternoon had started like any other in the Peterson household. Carol Peterson, a dedicated elementary school teacher at nearby Sunset Elementary, had finished grading papers at the kitchen table while keeping one eye on her daughter through the large bay window that overlooked their front yard. Jim Peterson, a construction foreman with weathered hands and an easy smile, was in the garage tinkering with his vintage Mustang, a weekend hobby that helped him unwind from the pressures of managing construction crews across the Phoenix metropolitan area. Their 12-year-old son Danny was at baseball practice, something that would later become a source of endless guilt for the family. If only he had been home, if only someone else had been watching, if only they had made different choices that day. If you're following this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us bring these important missing person cases to light and potentially helps other families find the answers they desperately seek. Lily had been playing in the front yard, a space that the Peterson family had always considered completely safe. Their neighborhood was the kind of place where children rode bicycles until dark, where neighbors knew each other's names and looked out for one another's children, where the biggest concerns were typically about homework completion or getting kids to bed on time. The front yard itself was enclosed by a white picket fence that Jim had installed when they first moved to the house 6 years earlier, complete with a gate that squeaked whenever it opened, a sound that had become so familiar to the family that they barely noticed it anymore. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the 73-year-old widow who lived in the house directly next door, had been tending to her prize-winning roses when she heard that distinctive squeak of the Petersons' gate. She glanced up from her gardening to see a man she didn't recognize standing at the gate, talking quietly to Lily. Mrs. Hartwell would later describe the man as unremarkable. Average height, brown hair, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt that wouldn't stand out in any crowd. What struck her as slightly odd was how intently Lily seemed to be listening to him, nodding seriously as if receiving important instructions. But children in their neighborhood were generally well-behaved and respectful to adults, so Mrs. Hartwell simply returned her attention to her roses, assuming the man was perhaps a friend of the family or someone from the school district. When Carol looked up from her papers 15 minutes later, expecting to see her daughter still playing with her collection of sidewalk chalk, the front yard was empty. The gate stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the desert breeze. Lily's chalk drawings remained scattered across the concrete, a rainbow, a stick figure family, and the beginning of what appeared to be a flower garden. But there was no sign of the little girl herself. Carol's first reaction wasn't panic, but mild annoyance, assuming that Lily had wandered to a friend's house without permission, something that would normally result in a stern lecture about asking before leaving the yard. But as Carol called out Lily's name and received no response, a cold knot of fear began forming in her stomach. She walked through every room of their modest ranch-style home, calling for her daughter, checking under beds and in closets where Lily sometimes liked to hide when playing games. The house felt eerily quiet, filled only with the hum of the air conditioning unit working overtime against the July heat and the distant sound of Mrs. Hartwell's garden hose. When Jim emerged from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag, and saw his wife's pale, frightened expression, he immediately knew that something was terribly wrong. The initial search was frantic but organized, drawing on the natural instincts of parents who had always planned for the possibility of a lost child, but never imagined it would happen to their family. Jim immediately began canvassing the neighborhood, going door to door and asking every neighbor if they had seen Lily in the past hour. Carol started calling the parents of every child in Lily's second-grade class, her voice becoming increasingly strained as each conversation ended with the same response. No, they hadn't seen Lily. No, she wasn't at their house playing with their children. The Petersons' phone began ringing constantly as word spread through their tight-knit community, with friends and neighbors calling to offer help and ask if there was anything they could do. Within 2 hours of discovering Lily's absence, Jim made the call that would change their lives forever. His hands shook as he dialed 911, and his voice cracked when he spoke the words that no parent ever wants to say. "My daughter is missing." The Phoenix Police Department's response was swift and comprehensive, reflecting the protocols that had been developed and refined through years of handling missing children cases in a metropolitan area of over 4 million people. Within 30 minutes, patrol cars were parked throughout the Westfield neighborhood, and officers were conducting systematic searches of every house, garage, shed, and hiding place within a half-mile radius of the Peterson home. Detective Maria Vasquez, a 15-year veteran of the Phoenix Police Department's Missing Persons Unit, arrived at the Peterson house just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the front yard where Lily had been playing just hours earlier. Detective Vasquez had handled dozens of missing children cases during her career, and she knew that the first 24 hours were absolutely critical in determining whether a case would end in a joyful reunion or become one of the thousands of unsolved disappearances that haunted law enforcement databases across the country. Her preliminary interview with the Peterson family revealed no obvious red flags. This was clearly a loving, stable household with no history of domestic violence, substance abuse, or other risk factors that sometimes contributed to family-related disappearances. The investigation's first major breakthrough came from Mrs. Hartwell, whose detailed description of the unknown man at the gate provided investigators with their only potential lead. Working with a police sketch artist, she was able to provide enough detail to create a composite drawing that was immediately distributed to every law enforcement agency in Arizona and the surrounding states. The sketch showed a man in his 30s or 40s with brown hair, average build, and what Mrs. Hartwell described as kind eyes, a detail that would later prove to be tragically ironic given the true nature of his intentions. Hundreds of copies of the sketch were distributed to schools, community centers, shopping malls, and bus stations throughout the region. As the first week of the investigation progressed without any significant leads, the case was transferred to the FBI's Phoenix field office and assigned to Agent Rebecca Torres, a specialist in crimes against children who had built a reputation for her relentless pursuit of missing child cases. Agent Torres brought a level of resources and expertise that the local police department, despite their best efforts, simply couldn't match. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a preliminary profile of the suspected abductor, suggesting that he was likely a local resident who had been observing the Peterson family for some time before making his move. The psychological profile painted a disturbing picture of a perpetrator who was organized, patient, and sophisticated in his approach to child abduction. Unlike the stereotypical stranger danger scenarios that parents typically feared, random kidnappings by obviously dangerous individuals, this case appeared to involve someone who had studied the family's routines, identified vulnerabilities in their security, and approached Lily in a way that wouldn't immediately alarm her or attract attention from neighbors. The fact that Lily had apparently gone with the man willingly suggested that he had used some form of deception or authority figure impersonation to gain her trust. The search efforts that followed were unprecedented in their scope and intensity. The FBI coordinated with local law enforcement, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and dozens of volunteer organizations to conduct systematic searches of the entire Phoenix metropolitan area. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the desert surrounding the city, searching for any sign of a child or recent ground disturbance. Dive teams searched every body of water within 50 miles of the Peterson home. Search and rescue dogs were brought in from across the southwestern United States, following scent trails that seemed to lead away from the Peterson house, but invariably went cold after a few blocks. The media attention surrounding Lily's disappearance was intense and sustained, reflecting both the compelling nature of the case and the Peterson family's active efforts to keep their daughter's story in the public eye. Carol Peterson became a familiar face on local and national television programs, always clutching Lily's favorite stuffed rabbit and speaking directly to the camera as if her daughter might be watching. Her appearances were heartbreaking in their raw emotion, a mother's desperate plea for information, for the safe return of her child, for anyone who might have seen something to come forward with even the smallest detail that might help bring Lily home. Jim Peterson took a different approach to the media attention, focusing on the practical aspects of the search and investigation. He organized volunteer search parties that scoured the desert every weekend for months, created and distributed thousands of missing person flyers, and worked tirelessly to coordinate tips and leads that came in from across the country. His construction background proved invaluable in organizing these efforts. He knew how to manage large groups of people, how to divide territory systematically, and how to maintain morale and focus, even when weeks of searching produced no results. The impact on 12-year-old Danny Peterson was profound and lasting. Overnight, he went from being a typical middle schooler worried about baseball games and homework to being the older brother of the most famous missing child in Arizona. His friends didn't know how to act around him. His teachers treated him with a mixture of pity and excessive attention, and everywhere he went, people whispered about his family's tragedy. He began having nightmares about his sister being hurt or scared, and his academic performance suffered as he struggled to concentrate on anything other than wondering where Lily might be and whether she was safe. The first year of the investigation produced hundreds of leads, but no concrete results. The FBI received reports of Lily sightings from across the United States and several foreign countries, each of which was carefully investigated and ultimately determined to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. The reward money offered by the Peterson family and various local businesses eventually reached $75,000, attracting both legitimate tips and, unfortunately, a significant number of false claims from people hoping to profit from the family's desperation. Agent Torres and her team followed leads that took them to every corner of the American Southwest. They investigated a cult compound in rural Utah where witnesses reported seeing a blonde child matching Lily's description. They pursued reports of a man matching the suspect's description who had been seen with a young girl at a truck stop in New Mexico. They coordinated with Mexican authorities to investigate claims that Lily had been spotted in border towns frequented by human traffickers. Each lead required extensive resources to investigate properly, and each dead end added to the growing sense of desperation that surrounded the case. The psychological toll on the Peterson family became increasingly severe as the investigation stretched from months into years. Carol developed insomnia and anxiety that required medication and therapy to manage. She took a leave of absence from her teaching position, finding it impossible to focus on other people's children, while her own daughter remained missing. Jim continued working, but became increasingly isolated from his colleagues and friends, finding their attempts at normal conversation trivial and meaningless in the context of his family's crisis. The couple's marriage, while never failing completely, was strained to its breaking point by the constant stress and the different ways they coped with their grief and uncertainty. Danny's teenage years were shaped entirely by his sister's absence. He became interested in law enforcement and criminology, spending hours reading about missing person cases and criminal investigation techniques. His bedroom walls were covered with maps, timelines, and photographs related to Lily's case, creating a shrine to his missing sister that both motivated his desire to find her and prevented him from moving forward with his own life. His parents worried about his obsession, but also recognized that his research and insights sometimes provided valuable perspectives on the investigation. The community response to Lily's disappearance was extraordinary and sustained. The Westfield neighborhood organized annual vigils and fundraisers to support the search efforts and keep Lily's story in the public consciousness. Local businesses displayed her photograph in their windows and contributed resources to the investigation. Schools throughout the Phoenix area implemented new safety protocols and educational programs designed to teach children how to recognize and respond to potentially dangerous situations. The case became a rallying point for child safety advocacy throughout Arizona and beyond. As the investigation entered its third year, Agent Torres began to consider the possibility that the case might never be solved. The FBI's clearance rate for child abduction cases was higher than most other categories of crime, but cases that remained unsolved after the first few months became increasingly difficult to crack as evidence deteriorated, witnesses' memories faded, and leads became scarce. The psychological profile of the suspect had been refined and updated multiple times, but without new evidence or witnesses, profiling could only provide general guidance rather than specific investigative direction. The financial impact on the Peterson family was substantial, but secondary to their emotional suffering. They had spent their life savings on private investigators, reward money, and travel expenses related to following leads across the country. Jim took on additional construction projects and overtime work to fund the ongoing search efforts, often working 7 days a week despite the emotional exhaustion that made it difficult to focus on complex tasks. Carol applied for grants from various missing children organizations and spent countless hours writing letters to potential donors and supporters. In 2003, 7 years after Lily's disappearance, the Peterson family reached what psychologists call the chronic phase of ambiguous loss, a form of grief that occurs when loved ones disappear without confirmation of death. Unlike families who lose children to illness, accidents, or confirmed homicides, the Petersons couldn't complete the normal grieving process because they couldn't stop hoping that Lily might still be alive somewhere. This psychological limbo created unique challenges that required specialized counseling and support from therapists experienced in working with families of missing persons. Dr. Michael Brennan, a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma and loss, worked with the Peterson family to help them develop coping strategies for dealing with the uncertainty and ambiguity surrounding Lily's fate. His approach focused on helping them maintain hope while also building resilience and finding ways to experience joy and meaning in their lives despite the ongoing crisis. The therapy sessions were often difficult and emotionally intense, forcing the family to confront their fears about what might have happened to Lily while also acknowledging their need to continue living their own lives. The investigation took an unexpected turn in 2004 when DNA evidence from a child abduction case in Colorado matched biological material that had been collected from the Petersons' front gate shortly after Lily's disappearance. The Colorado case involved a similar modus operandi, a young girl who had been approached by a man matching the description of Lily's suspected abductor and who had disappeared under circumstances that suggested careful planning and preparation. However, the Colorado victim had been found after 3 days, traumatized but physically unharmed, and had been able to provide detailed information about her captor. The Colorado connection provided new hope and direction for the investigation. The perpetrator in that case had been identified as Robert Greenfield, a drifter with a history of mental illness and minor criminal offenses who had been moving from state to state for several years. Greenfield had been arrested and convicted for the Colorado kidnapping, but during his interrogation he had denied any involvement in other similar crimes and had specifically claimed never to have been in Arizona. His conviction and imprisonment meant that he was no longer a threat to other children, but it also meant that if he was responsible for Lily's disappearance, the information about her location might never be recovered. Agent Torres traveled to the Colorado Federal Prison, where Greenfield was serving his sentence, to conduct a series of interviews designed to determine whether he might have been responsible for Lily's abduction. Greenfield was a complex and disturbing individual, intelligent enough to plan sophisticated crimes, but also clearly suffering from psychological disorders that affected his perception of reality and his relationships with other people. During their conversations, he alternated between claiming complete innocence and making vague references to helping children find better families that suggested a delusional belief system that justified his criminal behavior. The breakthrough that Agent Torres had been hoping for came during her third interview with Greenfield, when he inadvertently mentioned details about Phoenix geography and the Westfield neighborhood that he couldn't have known unless he had spent time there. When confronted with this inconsistency in his story, Greenfield became agitated and eventually admitted to having traveled through Arizona during the summer of 1996, though he continued to deny any involvement in Lily's disappearance. His admission provided enough probable cause for investigators to obtain search warrants for locations where Greenfield had lived or worked in the years following Lily's abduction. The search efforts, based on Greenfield's known locations and associates, led investigators to a remote ranch in rural Montana, where Greenfield had worked as a handyman during the late 1990s. The ranch was owned by Margaret Greenfield, Robert's wife, who had maintained his innocence throughout his trial and imprisonment for the Colorado kidnapping. When FBI agents arrived at the ranch with search warrants in early 2005, they discovered evidence that children had been living there, including school materials, clothing, and personal items that appeared to belong to girls of various ages. Margaret Greenfield initially denied that any children other than her own adult daughters had ever lived on the ranch, but when confronted with the physical evidence and the potential charges she could face for harboring a fugitive and accessory to kidnapping, she finally admitted that her husband had brought several children to the ranch over the years. According to her account, Robert had told her that these were children from troubled families who needed safe places to stay temporarily while their parents dealt with various crises. She claimed to have believed these explanations and to have provided care and education for the children without understanding that they were actually kidnapping victims. The revelation that multiple children had been held at the Montana ranch led to a massive expansion of the investigation involving FBI field offices from across the western United States. Agents began working to identify all of the children who had lived at the ranch and to reunite them with their biological families. The process was complicated by the fact that some of the children had been very young when they were abducted and had limited memories of their original lives, while others had been subjected to psychological manipulation designed to make them believe that their biological families had abandoned them or mistreated them. The Peterson family learned about these developments through Agent Torres, who traveled to Phoenix to brief them personally on the investigation's progress. The news that Lily might still be alive was simultaneously the best and worst information they had received in 9 years. The possibility of reunion was everything they had prayed for, but the reality of what their daughter might have experienced during her captivity was almost too terrible to contemplate. Carol Peterson later described feeling as if she was experiencing every emotion simultaneously: hope, fear, rage, gratitude, and a desperate longing that threatened to overwhelm her ability to function. The process of determining which children from the Montana ranch might be missing persons from other states required extensive coordination between federal and local law enforcement agencies. FBI agents worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to cross-reference the physical characteristics and approximate ages of the children who had lived at the ranch with unsolved missing person cases from across the country. The process was complicated by the fact that some of the children had been at the ranch for several years and had changed significantly in appearance as they grew older. In October 2005, 9 years after Lily Peterson's disappearance, Agent Torres received a phone call that she had been hoping for since the beginning of her involvement in the case. One of the children recovered from the Montana ranch, a teenage girl who had been calling herself Anna Miller, had been positively identified through DNA testing as Lily Peterson. The girl had been living at the ranch for most of the past 9 years, believing that she was Margaret Greenfield's adopted daughter, and that her biological parents had given her up because they couldn't care for her properly. The psychological condition of the girl they now knew to be Lily Peterson was complex and heartbreaking. At 17 years old, she had no clear memories of her life before coming to the ranch, and she had been systematically told stories about her supposed biological family that painted them as drug addicts and neglectful parents who had sold her to pay their debts. The psychological manipulation had been so thorough that she initially refused to believe that the FBI agents were telling her the truth about her real identity, and expressed fear about being returned to people she had been conditioned to believe were dangerous. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in cult deprogramming and psychological manipulation, was brought in to work with Lily during the delicate process of helping her understand the truth about her situation. Dr. Chen's evaluation revealed that Lily had been subjected to systematic psychological conditioning designed to erase her original identity and replace it with complete dependency on the Greenfield family. The process had been subtle but comprehensive, involving isolation from outside information, constant reinforcement of false narratives about her past, and the creation of artificial emotional bonds that made her feel grateful to her captors rather than angry about her imprisonment. The question of how to reunite Lily with her biological family required careful planning and professional guidance. After 9 years of believing that her parents had abandoned her, and after forming genuine emotional attachments to the people who had raised her, Lily was not psychologically prepared for an immediate reunion with the Peterson family. Dr. Chen recommended a gradual process that would allow Lily to slowly adjust to the truth about her identity while receiving intensive therapy to help her process the trauma of her experiences. The Peterson family's reaction to learning that their daughter had been found alive was a complex mixture of joy, relief, and overwhelming anxiety about the reunion process. Carol Peterson later described feeling as if she was meeting her daughter for the first time, while simultaneously grieving for the 9 years of childhood that had been stolen from both of them. Jim Peterson struggled with intense anger toward the Greenfields and guilt about having given up the active search for his daughter just months before she was actually found. Danny, now 21 years old and a college student, faced the challenge of relating to a sister who was essentially a stranger, despite their shared genetics and early childhood experiences. The legal proceedings against Robert and Margaret Greenfield became one of the most complex and closely watched kidnapping cases in federal court history. Prosecutors faced the unique challenge of proving criminal intent in a case where the victim had been treated with apparent care and had formed genuine emotional attachments to her captors. Robert Greenfield's defense attorneys argued that their client's mental illness had prevented him from understanding the criminal nature of his actions and that he had genuinely believed he was rescuing children from harmful situations. Margaret Greenfield's case was even more legally complex because she had not been directly involved in the abductions, but had knowingly participated in housing and caring for kidnapped children for several years. Her defense team argued that she had been manipulated and deceived by her husband and had genuinely believed his explanations about helping children from troubled families. The prosecution countered that any reasonable person would have questioned the circumstances under which multiple children came to live at their isolated ranch without any official documentation or contact with social services agencies. The trial testimony included heartbreaking accounts from Lily Peterson and other recovered children about their experiences at the Montana ranch. While they had not been physically abused in the traditional sense, the psychological manipulation and isolation they had experienced constituted severe emotional abuse that had lasting effects on their development and mental health. Lily's testimony was particularly powerful because she was able to articulate the confusion and identity crisis that resulted from having her entire sense of self systematically erased and replaced with false memories and beliefs. The investigation also revealed that the Greenfields had been part of a larger network of individuals involved in child trafficking and illegal adoption schemes. Robert Greenfield had connections to several other people who had been investigated for similar crimes, and evidence suggested that some of the children who had lived at the Montana ranch had eventually been transferred to other families in different states. This revelation led to additional federal investigations and prosecutions that continued for several years after the original case was resolved. Robert Greenfield was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for multiple counts of kidnapping, child endangerment, and psychological abuse. The judge in the case noted that while Greenfield's mental illness might explain his behavior, it could not excuse the systematic destruction of multiple children's lives and the decades of suffering inflicted on their families. Margaret Greenfield received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, with the court acknowledging that while she had been manipulated by her husband, she had also made conscious choices to participate in the concealment of serious crimes. The process of Lily Peterson's psychological rehabilitation proved to be extraordinarily challenging and required several years of intensive therapy and support. Dr. Chen worked with her using techniques typically employed with cult survivors and victims of long-term psychological manipulation, helping her slowly distinguish between genuine memories of her early childhood and the fabricated stories that had been used to replace them. The process was complicated by the fact that Lily had genuinely happy memories of her time with the Greenfield family, creating cognitive dissonance that made her recovery particularly difficult. The Peterson family's adjustment to Lily's return required extensive family therapy and a complete reimagining of their relationships with each other. Carol Peterson struggled with feelings of inadequacy and guilt, wondering whether she had somehow failed as a mother to protect her child from abduction in the first place. Jim Peterson battled intense rage, not only toward the Greenfields, but also toward himself, for having made the decision to scale back the active search efforts just months before Lily was actually found. Danny Peterson faced the complex challenge of developing a relationship with a sister who shared his DNA, but had grown up in a completely different world, with different values, beliefs, and experiences. The media attention surrounding Lily's recovery was intense and sustained, reflecting the public's fascination with the rare occurrence of a missing child being found alive after such an extended period. While the publicity helped raise awareness about long-term kidnapping cases and the psychological manipulation of victims, it also subjected the Peterson family to scrutiny and pressure during the most vulnerable period of their lives. Lily, in particular, struggled with being portrayed alternately as a victim to be pitied or a survivor to be celebrated, when her own sense of identity remained fundamentally fragmented and uncertain. The decision to call the police when Lily first returned to the Peterson home, despite the overwhelming joy of her homecoming, proved to be crucial for ensuring that justice was served and that other potential victims were identified and rescued. Carol Peterson later explained that while their first instinct was simply to hold their daughter and never let her go, they quickly realized that her story contained details that didn't make sense and that suggested she might have been the victim of serious crimes. The family's willingness to prioritize truth and justice over their own immediate comfort ultimately led to the prosecution of the Greenfields and the rescue of other children who might otherwise have remained in captivity. Today, more than 2 decades after her original disappearance and more than a decade since her recovery, Lily Peterson has slowly constructed a life that bridges the gap between her stolen childhood and her uncertain future. She completed her high school education through specialized programs designed for trauma survivors and eventually earned a degree in social work with a focus on helping other victims of psychological manipulation and long-term captivity. Her relationship with her biological family remains complex but loving, marked by both profound gratitude for their unwavering support and occasional tension over the years of shared experiences that can never be recovered. The Peterson family's story has become a powerful example of resilience, determination, and the importance of never giving up hope, even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. Their experience has contributed to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies handle missing children cases, particularly those involving potential long-term captivity and psychological manipulation. Agent Torres, who retired shortly after Lily's recovery, has become a consultant specializing in cold case missing children investigations, bringing the hard-won wisdom from Lily's case to help other families who are still searching for answers. The case has also highlighted the sophisticated forms that child exploitation can take in modern society, and the importance of understanding psychological manipulation as a form of abuse that can be just as damaging as physical violence. The techniques used by Robert Greenfield to control and manipulate his victims have been studied by psychologists and law enforcement professionals as examples of how predators can exploit children's natural trust and dependency to maintain long-term control over their victims. The investigation into the Greenfield network ultimately led to the recovery of 12 other missing children from across the western United States, some of whom had been missing for even longer than Lily Peterson. Each reunion brought joy to families who had long given up hope, while also revealing the extensive nature of the crimes that had been committed and the sophisticated methods used to conceal them. The success of these recoveries has provided law enforcement agencies with valuable insights into how similar cases might be investigated and resolved in the future. For the Peterson family, Lily's recovery marked not an end to their ordeal, but rather the beginning of a different kind of challenge, learning how to be a family again after 9 years of absence, trauma, and fundamental change. The process has required patience, professional help, and a willingness to accept that their relationships would never be exactly what they might have been if the abduction had never occurred. However, their commitment to each other and their shared determination to build a positive future has enabled them to create new forms of love and connection that honor both their past suffering and their present hope. The story serves as a reminder that even in cases where hope seems lost and years have passed without answers, the possibility of resolution and reunion can never be entirely abandoned. The Peterson family's decision to maintain their search efforts for 9 years, and their courage in calling the police when their daughter finally returned, ultimately led not only to justice for their own family, but to the rescue of numerous other children who might otherwise have remained forever lost. Their experience demonstrates that sometimes the most loving and difficult choice is to pursue truth and justice, even when the immediate emotional cost seems almost unbearable.